Welcome to the Evolved Caveman Podcast. I am Dr. John, the guide for your heroic journey towards greater health, success, and most importantly, happiness. And now, on with the show. Hey everybody, this is Dr. John, and a quick PSA regarding my new virtual men's group that meets on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Pacific time. There's only a few spots left, but I thought you might want to know about it. It's a quick, easy, and cheap way to work with me. And maybe some of you have a career. Maybe you've made some money. Maybe you have a reputation for yourself at work. But maybe what you lack is things like happiness or purpose, a fulfilling relationship, or a healthy sex life. The passion, happiness, and ease that you once had with your spouse. An emotion other than numbness, disconnection, or irritability. This group is for men who are trying to be values-driven, interested in lifelong learning, and curious about how to become the best possible versions of themselves. The group is not for men who want to remain in the comfort zone while sitting at home watching TV. So again, group meets weekly, Wednesday, 7 p.m. It's only $95 per session, and you can call 510-863-0057 for more details. That's 510-863-0057. And now, on with the show. Hey, everybody, this is Dr. John back with yet another episode of the Evolved Caveman Podcast. And I got to say, I am pretty psyched today to have with me Dr. Mike Rucker. Mike is an organizational psychologist, a behavioral scientist, a pretty smart guy, and charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. He's been published in publications like the International Journal of Workplace Health Management. Wow, that's a mouthful. His ideas about fun and health have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Fast Company, Psychology Today, Forbes, and many more. He currently serves as a senior leader at Active Wellness and is the author of the book, The Fun Habit, which is out right now and available at Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, and most airports across the country. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here too. So.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you here. The first interview, the first conversation that we had was such a kick in the pants. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah.
So tell me your story. How did you come to the point of writing this book, The Fun Habit? It's not a normal research topic.
Yeah. So as you gave a nod, I've been studying positive psychology for quite some time. The IPPA came forth around 2005, 2006. And for folks that don't know what positive psychology is, it's essentially an offshoot of traditional clinical psychology that wanted to look at psychological tools for betterment rather than, using, up until that point, it had been primarily used to treat, cognitive deficits and, poor mental hygiene and things.
Psychology traditionally has looked at how we're broken. Positive psych looks at how can we become better.
Yeah, it's more eloquently said.
Well, I'm trying to, make it digestible, I suppose.
Yeah, fair enough. And so I'd really, being a zealot of that space, I had used all those tools quite effectively, to be quite honest, for a long time. And also, when I was studying that work, I lived in San Francisco with my wife and really got in bed with the quantified self movement too, Gary Wolfe. And, for folks in the Bay Area might be familiar with that. And so not only was I using these psychological principles, but was over quantifying, trying to find correlations in my day and really being too concerned with my own happiness. But in that period, didn't realize that could be problematic. And so the short version of the story is, in 2016, my younger brother passed away. So I had this good stretch, right, of, using things like gratitude and mindfulness and, all these kind of biohacky things, to kind of over optimize, and was just in my lane. Right. But didn't have very, and I can say this in the rearview mirror, it's kind of, giving away the plot, but I had really poor emotional flexibility because I had been on a high for so long. And so not only did my younger brother pass away that year, but after being an avid endurance athlete, found out that I had likely an undiagnosed injury, or it could be osteoarthritis. Well, it certainly was osteoarthritis, but likely because of an undiagnosed injury. And I was going to need a hip replacement, which meant at the age of 44. And when you get them that young, you're essentially told not to run again because, these mechanical parts have a shelf life, so you usually get them in your 60s and you're fine. But, at 45 with a 25-year shelf life, they don't want you to come in for your vision because, it tends to have a lot worse outcomes. So, cycling and swimming, but, running, which had been the way I mitigated stress, definitely a part of my identity, was essentially taken away. And so I tried to use these same tools that had propped me up for so long, essentially, good vibes only and all this BS. And
so toxic positivity, is that kind of where you're
about right? Yeah. Okay. I mean, now we have a word for it, right? Back then, it was still inspiration porn or whatever.
I like that phrase.
Yeah.
Sounds like Instagram.
Now we know, actually, in your backyard, the researcher I like the best in this area, Dr. Iris Mouse, is out of University of California, Berkeley. Her and others were looking at this phenomenon, I guess, serendipitously around the same time, that this Western ideal, so not necessarily valuing happiness, but being overly concerned with it to this, the extent that you're chasing it, you're ruminating on the fact that, why, even in inappropriate times like the loss of a loved one, you're kind of thinking about how do I get out of this, instead of unpacking the emotional density in the moment. That it's sort of like cognitive behavioral therapy in reverse. You can draw a straight line to clinical outcomes. And that's where I found myself, like that rumination and that, just, I can will myself out of this, this state that I'm in. I was butting up the gray area of a clinical diagnosis. And so of potentially, depression. I mean, I might have even dipped into there,
Well, and I mean, you're grieving at this time too, right? I mean, you're grieving on a couple levels. You lost your brother, and then you also lost part of your identity with the hip replacement.
That's right. And like, it's a double whammy on the identity. So certainly the loss of a loved one. And then that's my only brother. So, now I'm an only child, right? You go from, us being this dynamic duo because our parents are complex, like they're both professors at UC Davis. So
they're kind of smart too.
Yeah, but they're also, esoteric, and there's I love them to death, but it's nice that, and
to have someone who gets you.
Yeah, exactly. And, poke fun at it. And I deal with, now that I've lost running, most of the way I mitigate anxiety is through humor. And my brother was really good at that. Anyway, so I was like, okay, I was smart enough. I feel like I've always been able to be meta enough to understand I'm heading in the wrong direction.
Pardon me, but let me pause you there. Please. Explain that idea of meta to the listeners, because that's a really important concept.
Yeah, where you can step outside of yourself and understand the direction that, you're able to step into the role of observer and go, whoa, I think my actions here might be problematic. I might not necessarily know why, but I can't stay in this space.
Yeah, because it's a critical skill for self-awareness and changing your own behavior and reducing the intensity of negative emotions or uncomfortable emotions. I mean, it's a big deal for those of you that aren't familiar with it.
Yeah.
Metacognition, meta-emotion.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Because I certainly have had issues where I've had need to unpack that. And so, to the degree, whether it was developed or inherent, I don't know, but I knew something was wrong. And so being an academic, luckily enough, I was introduced to Dr. Mouse's work, which suggests that, again, that this real problem was brewing in the US, this idea that chasing happiness, could really lead to you paradoxically being unhappy. And so that's great, that insight, right? We get these insights, but when there's not much action you can take from it, you kind of need to carve your path, right? And that was the beginning of what's now the fun habit. Like, okay, if the activity of evaluation, which is essentially the way we look at happiness now, especially in the Western world, like, okay, are you happy? You need to stop, get out of the moment, evaluate your circumstance. It becomes
which destroys happiness when you
exactly it. Right. Yeah,
it just goes poof.
Yeah. So I think what I really did, I can say this more saliently now because I've answered it. I don't know that I knew it at the launch of the book, but I think where I really was able to lean on is my academic background is in workplace wellness and the construct of autonomy. We know through tons of research that a high level of autonomy correlates quite highly with both psychological and physiological positive outcomes, right?
And I imagine workplace satisfaction as well.
Yeah, all the above. I mean, okay. It's grounded in social determination theory, but again, most people understand the construct of autonomy.
Is that DESI?
Yeah, DC. Yeah,
DC.
And I only know that because of the Audible book.
Okay, yeah, because there's a lot of researchers. I'm like, I think that's how you pronounce it.
It was so great. I mean, just a quick aside, but I especially because I cited a lot of folks from Eastern Europe and Israel. And I was so humbled how many people, like, if I had met them, they just like, who is this idiot?
Butcher their name. It's terrible. Now I'm like, how do you pronounce your name?
Me or
no? I'll ask everyone when I meet them because I
think you gave me that courtesy, because some people, it's a German name, and I would much rather be Rucker because you can imagine having a name like Rucker as a child. It's an easy.
Does something rhyme with that?
Yeah, right.
I don't get it.
There's a few things. It starts with S and ends with F. Depending on your level of
your age. Yeah,
that's right.
What level of school you're in?
Yeah. So getting back to unpacking. Okay, so this became problematic, and I was made aware of it quickly. So what could I do different? And so I fell back on. So we've talked about how autonomy is so important in the workplace, but in the modern world that we live in, a lot of our autonomy has kind of been through social norm or whatever, kind of taken away from us in our life outside of work. And I think that certainly happens when we're prescribing to somebody else's ideal of happiness, which can happen when, just haphazardly, because of social media, because we all compare ourselves to our friends when we're not being mindful, or we're taken out of access to being mindful, right? Like I was in a period of my life where I was trying to find meaning in something that was quite awful, right? And so when you're in, whether you call it sense making or meaning making, that can take you out of the moment because you have to get in your own head to unpack.
So pardon me if I can pause you there. Please. Is that the idea of post-traumatic growth where you're asking yourself, what am I supposed to learn from this tragic event?
Not necessarily in the book. That's where you do need to do that work for emotional.
I was asking about you personally.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But I was stuck. So I wasn't doing that work. I wasn't creating the emotional space to do it. And
I think if you're grieving, it's going to be doubly hard to do that work in the moment until that grief lifts a little bit, I would think.
No, you're absolutely right. And what I was doing was not giving myself permission to grieve. I was trying to, hold it
at arm's length and deny it.
And like, we'll get through this.
You're such a man.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Or like, this isn't what your brother would want, just all sorts of weird things. And so I think, a lot of the message is about permission, especially for men our age, right? I mean, they're just, and the headwinds are different. It's somewhat like when we talk about, even though this is apples and oranges, like the complexity of obesity, right? When you see someone sort of prescribing one way, right? Well, obesity is a complex problem. So you kind of need to look at the toolbox and then figure out what's the tool you need for your specific problem. I think the lack of fun that so many men have in their lives is a complex problem. Some people, it's because they're, too easily addicted to technology, like even, like Slack notifications and email becomes addictive, right? So you want to preserve time for leisure, but you have these things that bring you back. Some people are stuck, in a Puritan work ethic. I certainly was. My parents lived in a publisher parish mindset. And so I think for me, a lot of my self-worth is derived from productivity.
I think some men are addicted to that feeling of importance and knowing what's expected of them and being valued and respected at work. And when they go home, they don't get the same experience.
Yeah, 100%.
I think that feeling of stress and, just doing and achieving is highly addictive.
Yeah, and it certainly is. And then fueled by the fact that we live in an individualistic society, right? Because it's clear that even high performing individuals that live, in Eastern countries where the celebrations, but also the pain are dissipated throughout the group, right? Because there's this kind of collective effervescence.
Collectivist.
Yeah. And so, but for us, all the slings and arrows are aiming for our heads specifically, right? And so, we have these flashes of things that really go well, and we tend to celebrate them ourselves and look for outside validation. But to your point, because we're all kind of worried about ourselves, sometimes that doesn't come.
Well, and I think if I can jump in there, pardon me for interrupting. Please. I think part of that is that, learning to go from external validation to internal validation, because I think we grow up getting off on that external validation, being validated from the outside coming in. Oh, I got an A on this test, or oh my gosh, he thinks I did a great job. And I think the more we can get to kind of self-awareness, so we are familiar with our own values and how we feel, and then validate ourselves, for instance, because we're acting in accordance with our values, or we know we're trying to do the right thing, far better way to go in terms of building putting circumstances in your life where you feel happiness more often.
Yeah. And I know, from listening to your podcast, that's where you help men, direct their sort of energy. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I have been trying to unpack the reasoning. I don't do this as much in the book because the book's more kind of, tactical, but I fall back on the work of Alan Watts and others. I think meritocracy does have an important, part of this story, right? I mean, we're from, the onset of probably second grade, everything is, how did you do? And how do you rank against, your fellow man and woman? And so that's just an inherent part of the game that we're playing, especially in the Western world, right?
Well, and I've heard also that those judgments are impossible to stop. Like, we can't stop comparing ourselves against others. So we have to, it's kind of that first voice, second voice idea, where the first voice is going to come, that drunk monkey mind's going to do what it's going to do. But you kind of work on, how do I relate to that comparison once it comes up? Yeah.
And another interesting construct that I've been introduced to as I share these ideas, I forget if we were rolling or not yet, but, one of the funnest things is, coalescing all of the ideas of smart people that have been looking at this for quite some time, right? And so as I share this, a few folks have indicated to me that it's kind of a interesting time too, if you're in middle age, right? Like, there's been several analogies shared with me and they all seem to sort of work. But I think, up until, let's just say middle age, whatever that means for you, to some degree, you want that meritocracy because, for personal growth, that carrot helps you decide, as long as you feel like you're heading in the right direction, it provides some motivation to do things that you might not want to do. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it helps bring you to that. But the metaphor that I like the best, I think it comes from a book that I haven't read yet, but that was recommended to me called Pathfinder, is that you scale that first mountain and then you realize in middle age, there's a second mountain. And that second mountain, you get to play in reverse, right? Whether you want to call it writing your obituary instead of writing your resume or whatever framework works for you. Now you get to cement the goalpost, right? Because the goalpost your whole life has been moving. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. Again, I prescribe to thinking that there's probably more blessing than curse, the first half of your life, because it's helping you, understand, what your value is and keeps you motivated to kind of, get to a place where you're going to have the resources where you can do the deeper work to understand what's really meaningful for you and whether or not you're going to have the economic engine to be of service to others. But then when you get there, right, it's an amazing space. But so many of us here in the West, and I certainly think this is, part of the story of the fun habit, we're so wound up by the time we get there that if you kind of take a deep breath, like a crazy wind up toy, right? You're just like, and directionless. And so that's where you need to step aside and be like, let's cement this goalpost. What's meaningful for me? I'll let you opine. But
I think that you're absolutely right. That sympathetic nervous system gets stuck in the on position, the stress response, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And we get addicted to it. We get a feeling of empowerment. And I think it's really hard for a lot of men that I talk to learn how to turn it off. Like to learn how to do versus be is very challenging for a lot of people. And yet I think it's one of the keys. So let me ask you this though.
And I chuckle because I'm throwing a huge rock at a glass house. So I'm on a sabbatical right now. I'm taking my own advice. And
good for you.
I'm practicing taking more than 1 hour out of the day to lean into calm. And it's so uncomfortable because I've essentially had 2 jobs for the last 20 years, right? Between the book and getting my PhD, it's always been in conjunction with a 40-hour-a-week job.
Wow.
And so I don't know how much longer I want to have 2-hour time blocks where I'm not doing anything. But like right now, it's a useful exercise because like that's a weird place to be where you can't be calm for a couple hours, right? Where your body, to your point,
Well, and I think we spend most of our lives running away from ourselves, distracting ourselves from ourselves with work or doing. And it really does not serve us at all in terms of self-awareness and or happiness, however you want to define happiness, life satisfaction. But let me ask you this, why should we give a shit about fun and playfulness? Like, I'm a busy CEO. I don't got time for fun. What are you talking about? Like, I'm important. I do important shit. Why should I have any interest in fun?
Yeah. So from a scientific standpoint, I think the easiest way to sort of explain it to your point, and you can stop me and then regurgitate it. But it's clear that preserving that time where you're not caught up in productivity, let's call it leisure. You could call it, active leisure if you want, is as important as sleep with regards to letting ourselves create the cognitive safe space to unpack all the things that happen within the week. And so the science that I like the most in this area is called the hedonic flexibility principle. And so what they found is that people that have ground themselves out, grinded themselves to a nub, are the ones that are looking for poor ways to escape that discomfort, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe let's say you work, from the time you get up 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. Those are the ones that tend to go out and have some drinks. If they're a family person, they sit on the couch and think they're hanging out with their kids, but, are displacing that discomfort, scrolling social media or doom scrolling the news or whatever it is.
Yeah. And not present with the kids when they're with the kids or their spouse.
Yeah, because it's easy, right? And again, we call it passive leisure because you're not with it. The folks that have good transition rituals are very deliberate about, making time for their partners, engaging in pro-social behavior, engaging in what we call active leisure. So hobbies. So it's not necessarily work, but things that light them up, might be dance classes, might be, spiritual practice, whatever it means for you, but things outside of productivity, quote unquote, are the ones that show up the next day with a vigor and vitality to tackle the day. So ironically, they're having a lot more fun than the other group and they're more productive, right? If you're looking at productivity as just a quantitative measure, they're producing more too. But what I didn't say distinctly enough in the book, and now I wish I did, if there's a version 2, is that another nugget from that study, because I've now had time to talk to some of the professors, is those people also look for harder challenges. So that might be within active leisure. So they might be mountain climbers or kite surfers or whatever.
Wow.
But they also look for the harder challenges in their work. So they're the most innovative people because a lot of the times, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about was creativity, innovation, inspiration, because I know that, some of the greatest thinkers throughout the history of humankind often had some sort of a ritual where they would, if they're trying to tackle a problem, they would take in all sorts of information around the issue. And then they would put it aside and do something like go for a walk in the garden or take a shower or take a nap. Because if we're trying to solve complex problems, the conscious mind isn't capable of doing that generally. It's got to be the unconscious mind. That's where inspiration comes from, in my opinion, default network perhaps. But to have that ritual of letting go of it and to stop thinking about it, and that's when the aha comes, seems to kind of factor into what you're saying.
No, absolutely. And you probably already understand the science behind it. Like, when the amygdala is going, you tend to need to rely on your heuristics and an algorithm to get from point A to point B.
Explain heuristics for people.
They're essentially just instructions that sometimes they're biases, but they're a way to filter out external noise, to not bring in all the information so that we can get to an answer quicker.
Would you say heuristics are unconscious, automatic?
For the most part.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
shortcuts to conscious thinking. I'm just thinking about that out loud right now.
I think you're on. I mean, they're essentially a way, the way it's just that it's been described to me, but you said it in a way that gels with that, the definition that I would say is a way to filter out information, so you don't have to bring in system two thinking. You need to make a decision quickly, right? And so, whether that's through the subconscious or whether that's I'm taking something at first blush, right? Then and making a snap judgment, because I think you could still use your intellect, but the way you described it is spot on. And sometimes that trips us up, right? Certainly, with regards to racism and things like that, it can get problematic, but it is helpful, and heuristics are helpful. That's the reason that they exist from an evolutionary standpoint. And algorithmic thinking is helpful, right? I mean, anyone that geeks out on the neuroscience knows, there are folks that have Alzheimer's who have kind of lost, the ability to kind of, use their prefrontal cortex, but still can, do a 2-hour walk from home because, from church, because they did it their whole life. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we know when we're under stress, these things that are inherent, whether they're in our subconscious or not, maybe that's debatable, but they're essentially pre-existing instructions to get us from point A to point B and don't require us to think outside the box. And when we free ourselves up from that stress by letting our hair down, for lack of a better metaphor, then to your point, that's exactly it. And that is why innovative people have their aha moments in the shower, in a walk in nature, in the weirdest places.
The other way is staring at the wall or staring out the window, right? That's how you activate the default network, which that kind of cracked me up. I'll tell clients that you can tap into greater creativity by just kind of stupidly or blankly staring at the wall. I'm not sure they believe me.
Well, it's anything to be able to slow down the mind, right?
Yeah.
Often if we're stuck in a problem, it's the same sort of, my understanding, it's the same sort of phenomena, when we remember someone's name, I don't
do that. I don't remember names.
No, but I meant when you'll remember it the next day, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that might happen.
Because what we believe is that there are things going on in the background, because, if we believe that it's important, there's ways to index information that might be stuck. And so our brain's an interesting computer, right? But that's all to say that, in short, is that fun is as needed as sleep. It's clear, that, again, there's different terms for it, depending on how the study goes, but we need time for leisure.
What do you think about Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory, which, kind of says that positive emotions, like, what you feel when you have fun, is that physiological reset button that, it resets the physiology of negative, uncomfortable emotions, brings the heart rate down, brings the pulse rate down, stops the skin conductance, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I give a tip of the hat to her in the book.
Right. She's amazing.
Yeah. And so, certainly that's grounded in my opinions of how this works. Yeah. And so, but also, an important note with her work is she was one of the folks that overprescribed her work, right? And perhaps some of it was bad statistics, but then also I think, like so much of positive psychology, was picked up, by lay people that didn't completely understand it. And so she has been a good steward to suggest that we also need negative emotions. Part of the broaden is that, like myself in 2016, if you're not allowing yourself to actualize the real slings and arrows of life, then when something bad does happen, you're going to have a pretty shitty time.
Yeah. And I think when last time we talked, I brought up that book by, I think it's Tal Ben-Sahar and Todd Kashdan, I believe. It's The Upside of Your Dark Side, which was an interesting book to be written by two positive psychologists. And I think very appropriate and important in the sense of, to your point of this emotional flexibility idea, that makes me think of mindfulness, which is, the core saying is allow whatever's arising to arise without judgment. And that without judgment part is really difficult and takes years of practice. And yet I think it's one of the most important skills we can begin to acquire. What's your thoughts?
No, I mean, again, I don't think we were rolling the tape yet, but it's where I become fascinated of the difference between affect and emotion.
Yeah, please go over that.
So if you buy into this school of thought with regards to emotion, which I do, is that we will have a physiological response to incoming stimuli, right? And so if it's fear, our heart rate goes up, we start to sweat a little bit. Adrenaline is, secreted so that, especially if you have a bias towards the fight response, well, I guess for both fight and flight, right? You're engaging better ability to use your muscles, that those things are just going to happen. And there's probably more biological predisposition. There are probably people that are going to have stronger response to incoming stimuli. And that stuff is set by biology. And that if we looked at the human race globally, that type of phenomena is going to be pretty well established with commonality. Mm-hmm. The emotional response is
that's the affect. The physiological response is the affect. I just want to make it clear.
Those are the things that we feel, right?
Okay. And then the emotion is
our interpretation of how that feels. And so you'll hear folks that are, good speaking coaches talk about, and I don't know if I 100% buy into this, but like you can reframe what you feel as anxiety because your heart rate's going up to excitement, right?
I've done that. It takes a few years to get it, but I do it before I speak.
I'm, similar to trying to get myself out of the malaise in 2016. Like I just started speaking and I'm like, this doesn't work. And I'm like, bro, you're going to like fly. But let's tie that back into why mindfulness is so important, but you got to put in the work, right? I mean, to create the space between the interpretation of affect and emotion, no matter where you fall on the science, and no one's going to really know that because they didn't hear our pre-conversation, right? But I think that's important work because then you can, even if you can't control your emotions, because I listened to your attachment episode and I do have anxious attachment. So a lot of times I will get in an anxious state and I feel like that's where I have done some pretty solid work because I'll be like, okay, your engine's revving up because this is how, unfortunately it's interpreted physiologically, but you don't have to have that emotional response. And I'll give myself some grace and it will dissipate because I can, unpack the emotional component of it.
I like the reframe of anxiety where, you get the heart rate going, you get the energy surge, you get, some skin, you get some sweating, skin conductance. I like reframing it as, oh, okay, cool. This is my body giving me energy to prepare me for a challenge. And then I'll talk to my body and be like, hey, like, thanks for the energy. I appreciate it. I acknowledge your effort. And oh, by the way, maybe a little bit too much for this challenge. So then you got to kind of work on bringing it down a little bit.
Well, and I take the easy way out, to be quite honest. And that's why I also buy into, what we just shared. I'll take propranolol. And because that blocks the physiological response.
Well, that's dampening the heart rate, right?
Right. And so, but again, because emotion's so tied to affect, since I dampen the affect, the emotion never happens. And I'm able to just go out there very calm.
Well, can I go back for a second to the mindfulness idea? Because one of the biggest things I learned about mindfulness was from Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson. And this was that there's a dose-related effect when it comes to mindfulness. So the more you practice, the more benefits you get. If you practice 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, that's awesome. Most of the research is done on that. And yet if you go to, a 3-day silent retreat, there's a bigger effect in terms of what you get in terms of benefits. But I think the other thing about mindfulness is, you talked about kind of an awareness of that chain between affect and emotion. And the other extension of that is between affect, emotion, and behavior. Because I'm always trying to teach people like, look, it's okay to feel angry. So you're going to have the affect there, then you're going to have the interpretation. But then how you behave as a result of feeling angry, that's where you can disconnect those two rather than them just being fused together and you punching someone in the face because you're angry within a third of a second.
Yeah.
And with mindfulness or with practice and self-awareness, you can increase that third of a second to half a second, 5 seconds, which gives you time to choose how you want to behave as a result of feeling angry.
Yeah. There's either creating that space, right? And I believe this is a little bit harder to do, but I've seen some folks, you changing the script, right? Mm-hmm. So,
reframing.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or that the inherent heuristic, like this heuristic's broken. It's now led me astray 3 times. This bias needs to be corrected.
Yeah.
Right. So my snap judgment is going to be not to hit this person, to get the hell out of that situation.
Well, and I think like one of the other skills I'll teach around that is depersonalization, which is, for those listening, a really fancy term for basically find any interpretation that you can other than the one where you take their behavior personally. So I remember I had a client that I had taught this to, and he went and got in an Uber, and the Uber driver was just noticeably irritable, short-tempered, didn't want to talk, was just in a terrible mood. And my client started to take it personally in the back seat. Like, what did I do to this fool? And then he was like, wait, I talked to John about this. Hold on. Let me see what other interpretations I can come up with. And he was like, okay, so he just got in a fight with his wife. The taxi union's putting heat on Uber drivers. His son just got arrested. He's hard up for finances. And as he played around with this concept, he could take it less personally and walked out having sympathy and empathy for the driver rather than anger towards.
Yeah. No,
I think that's a great practice.
Yeah. Because so many of us want to close the loop, especially if we're in a state of discomfort, right? And again, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I know this is grounded in, cognitive behavioral therapy. And once we have multiple potential plot lines, for lack of a better word, you probably have a better word to describe it, then we can choose one of them, right? But I'm not, we often talk about that when someone cuts us off, right? Like we just want to kill them. And then, but what happens if you now, even if it's pretend, like they're on their way because their wife is, 10 centimeters dilated.
Yeah.
Like then you're like, oh my gosh, why didn't I let them cut me off earlier? So yeah, I think those things are really helpful. And again, backed by a lot of proof. This isn't just conjecture. It's clear that those scripts can trip us up or be quite helpful, especially if we master them. It goes back to autonomy, right? We're now regaining control rather than, letting the situations control us.
Okay, there's a bunch of stuff I want to talk to you about, but one of the things that just crossed my mind. So how far have you come? Because I'm knowing your background, knowing your parents, my guess is you were, to a very large extent, over-identified with the thinker growing up.
Oh, absolutely.
And intelligence and rationality. How have you evolved or developed over the years, I guess I would say, away from that, or to balance it more with emotion?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be work in progress, right?
Absolutely.
I think. Yeah. So I'm on a journey for sure. I was lucky to have a really good mindfulness coach. I think I name dropped him when we were, talking last time, Dr. Michael Gervais. He's worked, he made a name for himself by being the sports psychologist for the Seattle Seahawks.
That's right.
Worked with Russell Wilson, and I just was lucky enough to get early access to him.
I'm not sure that's a feather in his cap right now.
Yeah, that's right. No, but he worked with him when he won the Super Bowl. I think.
Fair enough.
Yeah, he hasn't worked with him
Russell
for a
needs
while.
him again.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. And so, it's funny. It's true. The guy's just getting skewered right now.
It's terrible season. Anyway.
Especially, some aren't fair because they're attacking his religion, but they certainly.
Oh, that's brutal. Yeah, it's out of bounds.
Okay, I got it. Just with the release valve. I told you. Now that I don't run anymore, it's humorous. Because it's vicious, man. And some of his teammates are the indie folks, and that rightfully, aren't really happy with him. So, where were we? Michael gave me
your journey from intellect to emotion.
Yeah, I think, even the book was still, as it was a form of personal growth, but did I still want it to sell well? even though I advocate for not living an outcome focused life, I think, any component of good mental hygiene is being able to have both coexist. Right. And so it's still, for me, paying attention to that balance, because I still want to be a driven person. Now in the second half of my life, I want it to be more service oriented rather than serving me. And I hope that's a sign of my emotional growth, or at least a sign of maturity, if nothing else. But do I still want to make a positive impact and be able to measure that in some regard? Probably, because I've always, I have succumbed to the social norms of living in a meritocracy. Like, I don't want to lie to you. I'm a work in progress for sure. And
I don't have a problem with what you said at all. I mean, I appreciate it. I just think it's the reason I asked the question is I think there's so many men out there that, we're socialized to over-identify with the thinker, to be rational, to believe that we are only rational and intellectual, which is complete and utter bullshit. Because even with goal pursuit, there's an emotional component to goal pursuit. If we want to motivate ourselves towards a long-term goal, one of the best ways to do it is to envision how you will feel when that goal is accomplished. And then also, I would argue figuring out ways to celebrate along the way, as long as they're not a big one. Yeah. I mean, they can't be, for lack of a better word, habituated, because then we know variable rewards are important. So they need to be different and varied. But, making sure, bring up the cliche because it plays, you do need to enjoy the journey. And so, I mean, kind of falling back on some of the insight from the book, I think too, if you look at system 1 and system 2 design, it's clear that the long game requires some system 1 motivation, reward, whatever. Explain system 1 and system 2 for the listeners. So system 1 is pleasurable. Like, we're attracted to it. Doesn't require cognitive load. We generally, it's something that's quick impulse. And so when you look at it through the lens of fun or pleasure, it's things that are immediately gratifying. Right. And is that hedonism? No, because hedonism, and this is, now I can explain this better because I was painted into a corner a couple times. Yeah, hedonism, I was just curious. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Right, it's an ethical construct. But hedonic tone is just a concept in emotional and behavioral science that means we're attracted to something and it's enjoyable, right? Okay. So that doesn't mean that it's an ethical construct by any stretch. It just suggests that that's a component of, again, to use kind of a academic term, the hedonic treadmill, right? Like, we're not meant to always be satiated. And so to strive to always be that way is as problematic as being overly concerned with happiness. But to say that we're not meant to live pleasurable lives, we know what that outcome is, right? I mean, it's why, sometimes I describe it as we've been so directed to live a life of martyrdom, right? For some, trophy at the end of the race. And it's clear that we're all falling off a cliff. You can just look at the stats. I mean, it's the reason you do what you do, right? Yeah. Because so many men are unhappy. I've seen so many men that just work their ass off and have made, make a lot of money, and work for some huge corporations for 30, 40 years. And then they finally get to retirement. And then they discover 6 months later that they have stage 4 cancer. Well, and we know that type of work too, right? Going back to the workplace wellness studies, I suggest if you're living that long, you're setting yourself up for failure. Yeah. The very pedestrian entry point is Bronnie Ware's work, right? I mean, she's talked to all these folks that have died and what they regret, right? So you can start there. But if you really want to dig into the science, that endless pursuit will make sure that at 65, you're not there to enjoy it. And so that becomes a really important mandate to take some time off the table. Again, then look at everything we've just talked about the last hour. And, it's so unfair and it's this huge paradox. But if you actually are enjoying yourself, you're going to actually have more at the end of the race anyways, and it's just so hard to get people there, which is unfortunate. The reason I gave that example was to highlight your point that we have to learn to enjoy the journey along the way. And I think, one of the ways to do that is to get better at spotting simple pleasures, like going for a hike or looking at the trees or the flowers or appreciating nature or, trying to connect with random people like the cashier at the grocery store and just see if you can get a smile out of them. Like all these little tiny positive emotions, if they accumulate over time, have a huge impact in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That goes.
And the other thing is, I think, just learning to pat yourself on the back for small steps in the right direction or behaving in accordance with your values.
Yeah, and that's back to that act of mindfulness, right? Like, right. Because you're enjoying that moment, you are where your feet are, and and then you just start to seek that stuff out. What was initially a downward spiral and wearing you down to a nub. And then, especially if you are a person of honor, where you're essentially looking at, like, how do I serve the people of my family? Once you kind of get out of that component of empathy, you start to see poor outcomes for the folks that you love as well, right? I mean, I've seen this from an empirical standpoint with physicians, because they're one of the, with regards to vocations, this was a worse year for them. 63% of physicians are reporting being burnt out. And so I'm kind of drawing a conclusion here, but from the data, we know that when a physician is burnt out, the patient outcomes for those physicians drop off a cliff. Well, you can look at the same thing with regards to just yourself and your loved ones. If you aren't enjoying at least some of the things you're doing, hopefully it's with the people you're with, but, potentially, creating transition rituals or finding the things that you enjoy, then over time, you aren't going to be there. You're not going to have the empathy that's required to have strong pro-social behavior. Yeah. And slowly but surely, you're not even going to have the energy to do the work.
And you won't have the presence. You won't even be with your loved ones when you're with them. Mike, do me a favor. Go back to that idea of transition rituals. Explain that a little bit, would you?
Well, this is like more at the tactical level, but it's clear that...
I like tactics.
Yeah. Well, I think in modern work, it's, I got this from Todd Herman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. I don't know Todd. He, I believe he made it a popular concept, but it comes from psychology because, psychologists use this as they're, especially if they're dealing with, severe patients and have this level of empathy, right? They kind of need to clear the palate so they can go in and be the best version of themselves for the next client, instead of sort of holding, this sexual abuse or things like that. Could you imagine, it's a tool used in various vocations to kind of reset, but adults, fathers, anybody can use this from transitioning from their work life into their home life or, time that's meant to be outside of work. And so it can be as simple as just turning off your phone so you're not getting bombarded by Slack or work emails. It could be making sure that the identity that you have at work, because maybe you are hard driving and that's your person and there's no reason to, remove that from your identity. But when you're with your wife and your kids, you're not meant to be a drill sergeant, right? You're meant to be a loving dad because that's the person that should show up. Like, how do you create that distinction between like, okay, I'm leaving this behind and I'm now moving into this other? Because with both the transition to heuristic work and for people, I stole that from Daniel Pink, but this idea that we used to make widgets and now we're the widgets that make things, for folks like Google and Facebook. There is no goalpost. Knowledge work can go on and on and on. And if you don't create clear boundaries, right, you could work until your head hits the pillow. And that's what a lot of us do. Fueled on by the fact that with mobile phones, we're essentially accessible 24/7. Yeah. And study after study suggests the people that do shut down aren't less productive. In fact, most of them are more productive, right? Yeah. So you're asking what to do? Shut down your phone. Or one of the things that I've suggested to executives in the past is, be aware that you're switching roles. Like I'm a big fan of this idea of being able to shift gears to bring different parts of yourself to different contexts or situations. So you're like your point, if you're a command and control leader, which I'm not a big fan of, but let's say you are, if you're command and control at work, that's not a good style to bring home to, a young daughter and your spouse. And so you want to have some sort of ritual to signify to yourself that you're switching roles, you're switching hats. And so I would suggest, just
stop at a park on the way home and just look at nature. And it doesn't have to be long, 2 or 3 minutes. Take a few deep breaths, remind yourself, okay, I'm going from work mode to home mode. I'm now dad, I'm now husband, and then continue on your way. And you just feel the shift in energy, the exhalation, and thus the relaxation, which now you're bringing that and presence into your home instead of the stress and frustration, let's say, of the workplace.
Yeah, that's a lot more sophisticated than.
Well, I don't know about that, but.
No, because the ones I think I highlight, there's a colleague that literally just says family time on our calendar. So like, not only that, because so many people are kind of, I had a similar, it's fine. Putting on your calendar time, family time, because it's an interesting artifact that your other colleagues can see, right? Like, oh, yeah. Wow, their calendar is blocked for family time. And most people will abide. For another dad, it was just flipping their ball cap backwards because that was, they were a frat boy, and that was kind of, that's when they, and
when it's funny, I like the idea also, because this is kind of setting boundaries too. Like, you're not going to allow work to infringe on your time with your family. And I like the idea. Or even
just yourself too, right?
Yeah.
Again, that's an important frame if you do want to be a great dad. And I fall in that category. But again, all these principles we talked about for the last hour are for the betterment of you too. Even if there's.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's got to be number one on the list too, like self-care,
exactly.
You've got to have something to put in your tank to serve others. But what I was going to say is, I love the idea that if you're setting boundaries, the people that get the most angry about those boundaries are the people that need those boundaries the most, or that you need those boundaries with the most.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think it's one of the first things, if anyone feels initial resistance to this. I just did an interview for Fatherly, and the gentleman was an amazing interviewer, but I couldn't get him there, right? And so what I suggested, and again, borrowed this from clinical psychology, like, let's lean in to this resistance. Like, why wouldn't you want to have, if you look at the frame of a week being 168 hours, why do you find it problematic that you would take 2 or 3, so less than 5% for yourself, even if that is, in the company of others, because you have to, you feel obligated to be with your partner or your kids, just to say like, hey, this is something that I would like to do, instead of it being, I have to do. And I think for anyone that feels stuck, like sitting in that space, similar to how I said I'm sitting in the space of discomfort, not doing anything for an hour, like, if you feel guilty about having fun 2 hours a week, then there's some deep work you need to do. The good news is, once you get past that big boulder, the rest becomes pretty easy. You start enjoying yourself. And then it's
fun and enjoyable.
Yeah, that's the paradox. Yeah. You're more productive, and now you're living a fun life. Like, it's such an easy sell.
You're enjoying life more.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, I'm aware of time, and I got to say, this was a fantastic interview. Thank you so much for coming aboard and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have?
No, I think we really got into it. I knew this was going to be a lot of fun, and it was. I think, we hit on the main topics. If you do feel stuck, show yourself some grace, but do the work, right? Fun, especially the idea of being attracted to the things that you do. So not just acts of whimsy, but making sure that you're enjoying some of the aspects of your life, how important that is to showing up as the best version of yourself. And then don't tackle it as just another thing to do on your to-do list. Make sure that you're creating space, finding, pockets of time in your week that aren't working for you. Usually they are those passive leisure activities, and it's as easy as looking at your Android or iPhone and seeing, how much time you're spending on certain apps. Generally, that's a good place to start. So clear the space first before you start to integrate, just kind of exploring things to do, so it doesn't, become another form of toxic positivity where you're just, creating a more busier life. That's, and then just start having fun, enjoy the benefits.
I love it. Well, and so again, the book is The Fun Habit. Go out, purchase it, read it, memorize it. And where can people reach you? And I'll have these in the show notes, but where would you like people to go if they want to find out more?
Yeah, I write a lot about the science of fun on michaelrucker.com. So if you're not ready to buy the book, it's free to check me out there. So
perfect. And then you're on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and some others like Substack and.
Yeah, and those are all accessible from the website. So
okay, and I'll have those links in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed the hell out of this, and I really appreciate the work you're doing because I think it's really important.
Likewise, Dr. John. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and that is it for this episode of the Evolved Caveman podcast. If you loved, if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate, review, and share. And if you didn't like it, you don't have to do a damn thing. That's it for this episode. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Evolved Caveman podcast. If you like what you've heard, support us by subscribing, leaving reviews, and sharing the podcast with friends and colleagues. For the latest, most powerful tools to connect with like-minded men, join the Facebook group at The Evolved Caveman. Follow Dr. John on Instagram at The Evolved Caveman, all one word, or join the email list by visiting guidetoself.com.